I thought we'd just start with a thought from each of the panellists about the bit of the Brexit negotiation, perhaps, that we as Brits don't really get the Europeans on. Jonathan, would you like to start?
Thank you. Well, to take up what you were saying, really, Peter, the European Union position is, this shouldn't surprise anyone, but apparently it does, a combination of the EU institutions in Brussels and their view of the collective interests of the European Union as such, and each of the 27 member states' view of that collective European Union interest, plus some of their own national interest. That all put together is the EU position, which at the moment is in gestation, as you know. Draft guidelines have been published. For the rest of this month, there will be discussions, and at the end of this month, there will be European Council guidelines, which will set the scene for Council negotiating directives, and ultimately the beginning of the negotiation proper. It's a complicated scene. Apparently it surprises people that Gibraltar has already been mentioned. Shouldn't surprise anybody that Spain is particularly interested in Gibraltar. The timing, I knew it would come up at some stage. Was it going to come up in the first few days? Who knows? But it shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody that that should be an issue, and that is only an example. What I can tell you from my previous pre-referendum experience was that all 27 other member states wanted the UK to remain a member state and were prepared to make considerable concessions in the process which led to the European Council decision, the so-called Cameron deal of February last year. Now, whether that all remains in place now that it's no longer a question of keeping the UK in, but negotiating the departure of the UK, remains to be seen. But from everything I've seen so far, despite the huge complexities, everybody goes into this negotiation intending to succeed.
Just one supplementary. From a British perspective, you read the British papers, the paragraph 22 on Gibraltar, from a British perspective, looks like a pretty clear attempt by the, and I paraphrase it, by Donald Tusk, by the European Council, to hand Spain a stick with which to beat the Brits in the Gibraltar negotiation. Now, is that a correct understanding, or how should we see it from a European perspective?
No, I don't think it should surprise anybody that Ireland is particularly concerned about the future of its relations with the United Kingdom and with Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, and it shouldn't surprise anybody that Spain is interested in the fate of Gibraltar in this context.
Brigid.
Let me begin with what I call the punishment narrative, and that is the United Kingdom has voted to leave the EU, it has issued a notification and will leave. It has now moved from being a member in the strict sense of EU 28, although legally yes, to being on the other side of the table. There tends to be, and because I read and I follow the debates in this country very closely, a narrative around punishment. If the EU does not give us everything we are looking for, the EU is out to punish us. That's absolutely not the case. The EU has lots of other priorities. Brexit is one. It complicates life enormously for the EU, its institutions, and the other member states, but it will deal with it, but it also has others. So why does the punishment narrative take off in this country? Because, of course, a good deal for the United Kingdom is holding on to as much as you possibly can in terms of your trading relations, your market access, and everything that goes with it, at the least cost to you. But on the other side of that table are 27 member states, as Jonathan said, and institutions that have an absolute priority to preserve the EU as a functioning entity in terms of cooperation and integration in the continent of Europe. And in the Tusk guidelines, and they're just draft guidelines, it is stated, non-members cannot have the same rights and enjoy the same benefits as members. So it's not punishment. It is simply the working through of the consequences of this country opting to remove itself from an entity called the European Union. It's not about punishment. And there's also, because historically in this country, there hasn't been what I would call an effective relationship with the EU in terms of identity structures and things. It has always been seen very much in terms of the economy and transaction. It's not just the economy. It's not just transactional. For many Europeans, the EU is an extremely important entity, both at the identity level, in terms of values, etc., etc. So the idea that the United Kingdom will be punished by the EU 27, absolutely not. But will they, first and foremost, in these negotiations, take care of their interests, the interests of EU 27 and what they see as important for its future? Absolutely. But no one should be surprised at this. And there is a phrase in Brussels that I was reminded of by Catherine Day, one of Jonathan's former colleagues, when she said in Brussels there's a statement or a view that says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And the United Kingdom has moved itself into quite a different position.
But it doesn't sound that friendly, that. You see, this is the problem, isn't it? Is that what is a logical consequence of our desire to be outside the single market, outside the customs union, or certainly, is simply us getting our just desserts. We're on the menu. I mean, clearly this is where there's a big gulf in expectation, and from a British perspective, that feels like the European side is in a defensive crouch. We've clearly moved to a new era where, unlike in past negotiations where we've upset the Europeans and they've huffed and puffed and they've given us opt-outs and carve-outs, ultimately there's been a desire to have a fix because we've been on the same side. We're now in a situation where, as you point out, our interests in certain dossiers will collide. How do we avoid what you don't call punishment, but what will be called punishment here, blowing the whole process up?
I think it depends in the end. So is this a very symmetrical negotiation between two equal negotiating groups? No. The United Kingdom has handed over the sequencing and the timing and a lot of the content in terms of the outcome that will be available. The European member states do not want to punish Britain, they want to be constructive, and they want a good outcome for both sides. But the definition of that will only emerge through these negotiations.
Pierre.
To follow up on what Brigid just said, and maybe to try to enlarge the discussion, it seems to me that one of the problems that maybe is not understood here in Britain is that the Europeans now have to think over about what EU 27, as we call it, is going to be shaped. And of course, the Brexit negotiation is going to have a lot of impact on that. And this is where I think one has to understand that for the EU 27, they're going to have one eye on the negotiation with Britain around the Article 50, be it the divorce, the transitional arrangements, the deep and specific and special partnership that your Prime Minister has been talking about time and again in her letter. But they have to look also at the consequences of all this on their own way of shaping the new EU 27 in the future. And I think we have to recognize, and we will have to recognize as we move on more and more, that there are many implications from one side to the other. Even if we haven't put our finger on it entirely today. The most obvious one, of course, is the one everybody's discussing. It's the bill. There will be a big hole in the budget. What do we do with that? But you have to understand that exactly at the same time, we're starting to discuss Britain will not be there anymore, and we regret it. It would have been great fun to be 28. We'll have to discuss the future of our financial resources and maybe to find new resources. And so the two discussions, to some extent, are going to interlink, and this is going to make it even more difficult. We have to find a solution to fill the hole, but we have to think also among ourselves about how to increase maybe our resources. Think about migration. If Britain wants to retain some sort of free trade agreement with the European Union, and at the same time wants to have some sort of control on migration, this will have implication for the EU27. You will have some of the member states inside the EU27 who will start saying, maybe I could use the same kind of arrangements we will have with Britain. You know, this is a very sensitive issue at the moment, and you could have a lot of this. This is why I think we tend to underestimate here in Britain the fact that for the EU27 as such, this whole negotiation is opening a sort of Pandora box, which is going to make it very difficult also to handle and to manage and to keep a grip on this whole negotiation. This is going to be difficult. I talked about migration, about money, but you could talk about defense and security, you could talk about the future of the Eurozone, so on and so forth.
It's a really interesting point, that, isn't it? Because the official EU position, it's been... The word unity gets used almost every time Donald Tusk gets to his feet, but we all know that lots of the dossiers, as you say, immigration, money, etc., bring up competing interests. Do you think that in the negotiation going forward that there will be a tendency on the 27 side to take a quite minimalist approach for fear of opening that Pandora's box? Is that going to be a restraining factor in us actually getting a deep deal?
It's very difficult to say at this stage, the interaction between one and the other. Of course, what would be the most easy way of doing this is to try to create a wall between negotiation on Article 50 on one side and the negotiation between the EU27 on their future in the different sectors on which they have to work together. But we all know this will not happen. You know, when you are whatever government of a member state, you're going to look at your own national interest according to one side or the other side of this wall. And you're going to look at it as an overall picture. So I think it's going to make this whole discussion even more complex. And I think we are only understanding how difficult this is going to be. And this is why when we're talking about a 2-year period, there is no doubt that this is going to be a very short time span for dealing with all this.
Excellent. Well, that's a very brief summary of three issues. We can go to questions now. Please, as usual, say who you are, introduce yourself. We'll take them one at a time, as long as people try to ask questions and not make speeches.
As you know, between the 3 main contenders, or you can even say maybe 4 main contenders at the moment, Mrs. Le Pen, Monsieur Macron, Monsieur Fillon and Monsieur Mélenchon, you have quite different economic programs. 2 of them are thinking about taking their distance with Europe. The 2 others are sticking more or less to Europe. So I think it will very much depend on that, because if you look at the future of our monetary and economic union, the Eurozone, of course, a lot of what is at stake is about whether France will be able to regain some of its competitive edge that it has lost recently, which means doing all the structural reforms we have been talking about for the last 5, 10 or 20 years, maybe to some extent, and we haven't been able to solve. That's absolutely necessary in order for France to regain some of its credibility among its European partners. And of course, when I'm talking about its European partners, I'm mostly talking about Germany. If we want the French-German partnership to find a new momentum, to get a new impulse, we have, for France, we have to go through these kind of reforms. Now, if you look at the different platforms of the candidates, Monsieur Fillon and Monsieur Macron talk openly about this need for reform, restructuring, it's not as obvious with regard to the two other candidates. So this is a major question mark that we have at the moment.
There was an interesting survey in the FT today, wasn't there, showing that central bankers were naming the euro as their biggest risk for 2017, were dumping euro assets in favour of sterling. Why is it such a binary choice? Jonathan, perhaps one for you.
It's not. Some member states are in the euro, some are not. Some are in Schengen, some are not. The EU already accommodates all sorts of difference. In fact, many people in Brussels think that the UK already had a rather privileged position and were surprised that it wasn't good enough. But there you are. But the core of the European Union is a single market and a single trade policy. And I see no suggestion in the other 27 that they want to relax that in any way. And if your question was about trade agreements, it's because they think they get better trade agreements negotiating collectively than they would individually.
Brigid,
well, I think Tusk, at least the draft guidelines clearly say that the EU will, and EU 27 will prepare for the possibility of failure, but wouldn't anticipate it. I can't imagine the EU 27 walking away lightly. I think that every effort will be made to reach an agreed solution to this. I think, for example, for the country I come from, for Ireland, a no agreement would be a disaster for the island of Ireland. It would, and this is not just a question of tariffs, although tariffs on agricultural goods would be higher, but it would put at risk the Good Friday Agreement and peace on the island of Ireland. And I think one of the things that struck me very forcibly during the referendum campaign here was how little understood in this country, in this island, on this island, the importance of joint UK-Irish membership of the EU was to stabilising and settling relations between the two communities in Northern Ireland. It allowed both sides to have sufficient ambiguity that they could be British or Irish or both. And what, again, I find extraordinary is that it took until Queen Elizabeth's 2011 visit to Ireland to really finally normalise Anglo-Irish relations since the foundation of the Irish state in 1922. It took that long. And I have to say that there is no one on the island of Ireland thinks, or very few, that Brexit will make things any better. There is deep, deep concern on the island of Ireland of the consequences of Brexit for that island. And therefore, I can't imagine, for example, any Irish government wanting to walk away from that table without a deal.
The French government is looking at this whole issue with his eyes very closely on what's going on with the presidential election. And of course, we have to take that into account. That doesn't mean, I think, that we're looking for punishment, but once again, one has to understand here in UK that in our different countries, be it Netherlands, be it France, be it other countries, we have our own domestic political problems and we have to face them. That's the first issue. The second one about Article 50 and the way it was written, the whole issue really at the beginning was about whether we should have had an Article 50 or not. You remember that during the convention and then afterwards, the Lisbon Treaty, there were a lot of people who thought that we should get rid of it, that this was something that we didn't want to have in our treaty because we thought the EU is an organization whose nature is different from any kind of international organization where you have always a provision in order to get out. So this was rather controversial in itself, and the way it was written, I guess everybody hoped that we would never have to use it. And we have discovered since then, and even the legal experts in Brussels have admitted that taking into due account the future of the relationship, which was put there as a sort of a small sentence in order to look at the future. And remember that at the beginning, legal experts were saying all the time last year that, you know, Article 50 was not about discussing the future partnership. Now we have all admitted that this is going to be a large part of the discussion. Now we have a debate about the sequencing. When does this discussion come in? But I think everybody has agreed, which is, if only to give you this example, a good way of showing that we're not trying to punish. We're just trying to find a way out of a situation that we have never seen before, and that we have all together on this one, the 28 of us, to find a way out of this problem where we are at the moment. So even legal experts have changed somewhat their mind about the interpretation of Article 50, which tells you that I don't think one should be too worried about the state of mind of the 27. I think where we should all be worried, and here again it's 28 altogether, is how are we going to handle a very difficult negotiation where right from the beginning we don't agree on the agenda, what should be the sequencing, etc. And we could spend a lot of time and lose a lot of time in just trying to connect the two pipelines together. And you know, having worked just like Jonathan many years in the European Union, this can take a lot of time. And I worry very much about this, because as long as we take posture, a tactical posture at the beginning, this could just push back the beginning of serious conversation. And this is where I think we should all be very careful about that. Think a little bit less about tactics and a little bit more about substance as early as possible.
But it's not just about posturing, is it? I mean, again, with the phrase, we're not trying to punish you, but if you read the Tusk letter, it's positively dictatorial. We shall determine when you have made sufficient progress, when you've eaten your greens, you shall have your dessert. And I think that's the way it reads in Britain. And the sequencing question that you raise, these are not just about posturing. The issue of money and the formula by which the money piece is going to be arrived at, and issues raised by citizens' rights. A lot of people think, well, we all agree we need to not have people as bargaining chips, overlooks a huge area of really complex and fundamental area about who's going to enforce that agreement on future citizens, which crosses into ECJ jurisdiction, another one of Mrs. May's red lines. These are really substantial issues. Jonathan, it feels like, from a British perspective, that we're being taken to the woodshed, to use a good British expression here, not engaging in a negotiation in which we can all, as Mrs. May wishes, end up in a deep, meaningful relationship. Is that a misunderstanding of the position, or is that just the fact of it?
It's simply the aftermath of a period in which people were led to believe that this was a glorious liberation, and that the other side had every interest in accommodating us now being the UK. And I think this is simply, these are the harsh winds of diplomatic reality. There's a negotiation between one country leaving an organization which has 27 members. Article 50 was written for all sorts of different reasons, but it says what it says. It has a very tight deadline. The 24 months, when you look at it more carefully, are barely 18 for real negotiation because of all the process at the beginning we're in now and at the end, when the British Parliament, the European Parliament, British Government, the Council of Ministers all have to sign off before the 2-year period ends. So there's not a lot of time, and the real issues are now coming out. And it's not going to be easy. I don't think anybody should be surprised unless they were a bit deluded in the first place.
And it's not a negotiation of equals.
Who knows? It hasn't started yet. Is it equals? Well, there will be 2 negotiating teams, one representing a country and the other representing an organization with 27 members.
So it's numerically unequal, but it's They don't have equal rights at the table.
Never mind yes, quality, it counts, and there will be very smart negotiators on both sides, I've no doubt. There's a great deal at stake. I mean, this is not to be belittled. This is a hugely important negotiation for the history of Europe, for the history of this country. The whole world is watching us. You'll have seen Mr. Trump make reasonably encouraging remarks in this morning's FT. They're all watching. And we Europeans, if I can still say that in this country, have got to get this right. But it's a daunting exercise.
Brigid, could Europe get it wrong? Do you think if Europe sticks too rigidly to what it's entitled to under Article 50, is too, I'm not going to use the word punitive because we're not engaged in punishment, is too uncompromising, do you think there's a chance that that blows back into Europe?
I think that, so Theresa May wants a deep and special relationship. The most ambitious free trade agreement that the EU has ever negotiated. I think the ask is enormous. So you're leaving the EU, you're disentangling yourself from this entity, but you're asking this entity to deliver to you the most ambitious free trade agreement in the history of this entity. And there isn't a single area of EU policy or public policy in this country that will not be affected. And it's all very well to say they'll be pushed, you know, that they'll be pushed back from the EU. But you open up any of these policy dossiers, and none of them are easy. So I don't think it's some sense of a rigid EU. But what the EU will do is it will defend it will essentially defend its constitutional framework. What is that? Its constitutional framework are its treaties and its jurisprudence. It will also defend, as far as it can, the cohesion of the remaining 27. So the stakes are extraordinarily high for the EU. And we must also remember that this is the voluntary exit of the United Kingdom from the EU. No one pushed the UK out. No one wanted the UK to embark on this journey. There was no government, or in my view, public opinion across the continent that wanted the UK to do this. But the UK is doing it, and in opting to do it, is doing it at the harder end of the Brexit options. There were other options. The EA agreement, EFTA. There are all sorts of other agreements. But if the UK puts down all these red lines about the ECJ and about free movement of people, then it's not, the demandeur is not the other side of the table. The demandeur is the government and parliament of this country.
Mandated by the British public in a referendum.
But no, I don't think the terms of leave were mandated by the referendum. The question was not on the ballot paper.
And let's not get into a relitigation of what the mandate is. This is about what Europe thinks. I've been very biased to this side.
No, but
sorry.
But Peter, that's important. Europe thinks that the decision to leave was the result of the referendum. The how and the terms are a matter of choice by the British government. That's what Europe thinks.
First of all, you're absolutely right, and extraordinarily, to some extent, we're already observing that. You know, the simple fact that now, usually at the highest level of the European Union, namely the European Council, you have one session with the Prime Minister from this country, and a second session with the EU 27, even if it's mostly to discuss Brexit, but also the future of the European Union makes a lot of difference. You know, the fact that the UK Prime Minister is not there anymore slowly creates new ways of working together. So, of course, to try to overcome that, bilateral relations will be necessary, no doubt about it. And I'm sure that the United Kingdom will be looking for this, and they're looking already at this very closely. Now, the whole question from the foreign policy point of view, it's what kind of geopolitics are we going to see slowly moving out of this? Are we going to go back to something that would look like the 19th century geopolitics, or would it be something different? I guess it will be something different because we're in a totally new world. But this is going to be a very fascinating scene and picture to observe as it goes on.
I think it will impoverish public policy making in this country. I listened very carefully to Douglas Carsdale when he talked about regaining control and being able to take the decisions here. But there actually is an enormous learning machine in the EU, where on labour market activation, on how you deal with environmental problems of one. Countries learn from each other, and they learn the best practice. And what they think is the only way of doing something, because obviously bureaucracies tend to think how they do things is the only way things can be done, are tested against ideas from all sorts of other places. And so there is this constant learning simply by being around the table. And I think that that's something that has not been factored in at all. And the other thing I would say is, paradoxically, the United Kingdom will have to invest much more in human resources in understanding the EU post-Brexit than it did as a member.
Yeah. But you know, the simple fact that British diplomats will not be there in the meetings, in the council meetings dealing with foreign policy or security policy or whatever, this will make a difference. You know, you won't have the same type of information. You don't have the same network. You're becoming a third country, so you have to knock at the door to be allowed in and to discuss with the different chancelleries about what they have talked about in Brussels.
Do you think that in practice there still will be a good flow of information, or do you think there will be a significant loss?
I think there'll be a loss, obviously. I mean, everything that's been said about the benefits of being at the table is absolutely right. For both sides, by the way, the others will lose. The EU will suffer a loss because the British have contributed a great deal over the last decades. And that's keenly, I mean, they would say that to me, wouldn't they? But I think my former colleagues genuinely believe that. They're sad at the loss that will be incurred by the rest of the EU. We, the British, will just have to work a great deal harder. Look at what the Swiss do. I don't know if there are any Swiss here, but the Swiss in Brussels have an extremely effective mission, an embassy. They work very hard. They talk to their neighbours. Look at the geographical situation of Switzerland, completely surrounded by the EU, members of Schengen, but outside all the possible institutional frameworks because they keep voting not to join them. So the Swiss just have to work very hard in bilateral diplomacy, in multilateral diplomacy, to keep informed and to understand what is going on, because they end up having to do it. Good old traditional diplomacy, I think, will have a comeback. The Foreign Office is going to be extremely busy. Its embassies in each of the European capitals and what ACREP becoming a mission to the European Union in Brussels will have a great deal of work to do simply to find out what's going on and to bring to bear whatever influence the United Kingdom can, because it remains an important country, of course, and an important neighbour. And then the soft diplomacy, Claudia's question there. Yes, culture and the English language remains important. The royal family, no doubt, has a role to play, as it did in Ireland. There's a great deal of soft stuff to be done as well. The United Kingdom remains respected, popular, liked in all sorts of ways. I hope that is maintained. But there'll have to be a lot of serious, hard diplomacy as well, just to keep up with what's going on, because Brussels will continue to function.
I think that both Brexit, but more importantly Trump, have already had a very serious impact on politics in continental Europe. We've seen from the Austrian presidential election, the populace was seen off. The Dutch election, again, Wilders was seen off. If Marine Le Pen is seen off this time, although she's not going to disappear, I think what you have seen, interestingly, on the continent is that basically standing up as a politician and saying the EU, with all of its problems and challenges and faults, is a necessary and good thing, gets you political traction now in a way it mightn't have 18 months ago. My concern for the United Kingdom in terms of the rejuvenation of politics, twofold. One, that Brexit is going to take so much public policy time, political time, and cabinet time that I'm not sure how this country can address all of the other things it needs to address. So I think there is that. And also the impact of Brexit on the kingdom itself, on the United Kingdom, in my view, is unknowable at this stage. We do not know, even if, for example, there's another Scottish referendum and it's defeated, you will still have a part of the United Kingdom that was taken out of the EU against the wishes of 62% of its population. In Northern Ireland, you have a very unstable political balance now. The demographics are shifting. Sinn Féin, for the first time ever since the foundation of Northern Ireland, the Unionists are not in the majority in Stormont. So there are all sorts of unknowable dynamics that could be unleashed by this. And that again will absorb political time and political energy. So I'm not sure that this country will get the so-called rejuvenation that one might have expected from such a big constitutional shock.
Brigid, to play devil's advocate here, I mean, that, I think, to a lot of Brits will sound like the kind of fantastically complacent view they hear from Europe all the time, in the sense that, yes, Hofer didn't win in Austria, but we'll see what happens in the 2018 parliamentary elections. The Dutch election campaign, Wilders didn't win, but Rutte ran a campaign with a big poster saying, be normal or be gone to migrants. If 45% of people vote for Marine Le Pen in France in the second round of the French election, is the populist revolution, is it over? Does Europe really think that they're home free?
No, no. I wouldn't think anyone is complacent about populism in Europe. All I am saying is that both Brexit, but in my view, more importantly, Trump, has had quite an important political effect in continental Europe. And has the chaos and the sense that institutions can be pulled down with relative ease and built with great difficulty is taking grip. So what I'm not saying at all that there's any room for complacency. All I'm saying is that there has been a political shift.
Pierre, Jonathan, does Trump harden the line?
No, I hope Brigid is right, by the way, and we're seeing a sort of reverse trend. I'm still cautious about this, and looking at my own country, I wouldn't like to make any prediction yet at the moment. But going back to what Anand was saying, it seems to me, and I'm quite fascinated by this, is that this whole issue about our democracy today, which I think is a very important issue, has been somewhat linked, totally linked to Europe. Europe appearing as a sort of scapegoat for all this, when in many cases Europe has very little to do. You know, the whole issue of, for instance, our tension in our suburbs is something that the European Union has not been involved in at all. Even to some extent, the whole issue of our national identity and people feeling that national identity is crumbling under the number of migrants stepping in has very little to do with Europe, by the way. Of course, people will tell me, but the recent migration crisis, etc., it's not really relevant to the issue we're facing there, which comes back from ages and ages. It's only that Europe has been a very useful scapegoat for all these trends moving in, because it has to some extent embodied the whole issue of a global economy, global world, and let's be honest also, because in recent years it hasn't been able to deliver, so it has been very easy to criticize Europe. But I think to try to put the two things together is dangerous, because at the end of the day, if we want to rejuvenate our democracies, it's not through Europe that we're going to do it. It's in each one of our member states that we have to think over about our democracies in a modern world, in a technological, modern, updated internet world, where today democracy goes through social networks with all these new phenomena we're witnessing. That is certainly a major issue. I personally hope that the EU institution will not get too much involved into this, because they would only complicate even further problems that I think is mostly for member states to try to solve.
Jonathan.
Very little to add. I mean, I think part of what happened here is shared with many other European countries, and part of it is purely British. Those bits which are shared with other countries in varying degrees from place to place do, of course, resonate across the continent, and some of it is only national, but some of it is European. And the European institutions and the European Union as a whole have a lot of work to do in thinking about the digestion of Brexit and whatever comes now in the negotiation, what it means to be an enlarged EU, 27, 28 countries, 27 now, to come, post-crisis, post the biggest enlargement, the biggest recession in our lifetimes, and so on. A lot has happened in the last few years. And I hope that the European policymakers and decision makers will take account of all of that as they think about the next steps in the European Union. 27, I hope, sticking together, moving forward together, but Brexit will have changed things, there's no doubt, because of the wider issues it throws up, which are not related solely to British politics and British history, but are continent-wide, the globalization issues and so on. I think they're very different situations, that's all I'll say.
Why?
The size of the country, the nature of the issue, it's not the same, except that I would say don't underestimate the unity of the 27 and the doggedness with which the European institutions and the member states will try to find solutions in their collective interest.
There is nothing in Article 50 about this. So it's, you know, whether in the case UK would suddenly want to stop and forget about withdrawal. So legal experts have had many discussions here and there about what could be done. I personally guess at the end of the day it will be mostly a political issue that has to be solved as such. You know, for the time being, as Jonathan said, we have accepted the result of the referendum, and EU27 is working on the assumption that this is what UK wants, to get out of the EU. So we're working on this. If anything new had to happen in that context, it would be really for the British government to tell us what is their latest state of mind, and then I guess all 28 leaders would have to decide how they do this.
Well, first of all, on the campaign itself, the European Commission played absolutely no part. We were asked not to campaign, we did not campaign, so we have no responsibility for that campaign and the way it was conducted and so on. Who is responsible for the general perception, reputation, image of the European Union in any country, in this one, for example? Of course, the European institutions have some part of that, as do the local politicians, the media, and all the people who present things to the public. So I'm not saying there is no responsibility. It's widely shared.
Right. How are we doing?
The EU27 and the European institutions are very real about Brexit. The British voted on a Thursday. I remember the outcome was clear by the Friday morning, and the Council Task Force on Brexit was set up by the following Tuesday. So the EU is both real and ready. And your argument that the EU is militarily weak, so it should do a quick accommodation, well, I will remind you that the predominant military institution in this part of the world is NATO, and that under Article 5, the United Kingdom is a member of NATO has obligations to the other members of NATO. So there is some traction for the United Kingdom in its security competence, but I wouldn't have that as the main bargaining chip. Not a good idea. It won't wing it. And in terms of the EU is bound down by sovereign debt. Some countries are, some countries are, and some countries are not. So just as the EU doesn't set out to punish the United Kingdom should not overestimate its bargaining power, should not overestimate what it brings to the table. It is an important country. It is a country that will be treated seriously, but it is not a country whose interests will be put ahead of the interests of the 27.
Could I add just one point? Please. Because I think this is, even for me, because sometimes I myself feel somewhat a bit worried about Europe's weakness. But the one thing that comforts me all the time is that if you look at the moment, the negotiations that we're having with several partners in the world on free trade agreements, Mexico, Japan, which just finished with Canada, other countries like China asking for a new generation of free trade agreement, it seems to indicate that maybe the credibility of the European Union is a little bit more complicated than you think.
Well, frankly, it's impossible to answer until we know the terms of withdrawal. That's if you concentrate solely on the tangible costs and benefits, and there are lots of intangible ones that are simply impossible to calculate. But even the tangible ones, if you take the EU budget as it is today, take the UK out of it, it still depends on the negotiation to come on the UK's responsibility for ongoing financial commitment. So I'm afraid it's impossible to answer that today.
Well, let me ask you a hypothetical. If, as seems almost certain, if the rich countries are not going to want to pay more, if the recipient countries, Poland, Hungary, etc., end up with less money in future MFF, in future budget rounds, is that going to weaken the cohesion of the EU? Is that going to weaken the political dynamic of the value of the EU to them?
No. First of all, the value of the EU is not only about money. It's about a great deal more than that for all those countries, the ones you've mentioned and all the others. And that's not an article of faith. I think that is clearly true. And we will have to see. You can think of all sorts of hypotheses. The British leave, there is no financial settlement, and there is no further contribution by the net contributors, so the budget has to shrink. You can take that all the way along the line. I don't think there's any purpose in doing that at the moment, because the negotiations now starting are going to have to deal with financial issues, and the EU as a whole, the 27 remaining countries, will have to arrive at a new financial settlement amongst themselves soon afterwards anyway.
Would the Brits be smart, rather than saying 50 billion is a nonsense, to agree to 50 billion and then keep the EU over a barrel as we get to the end of the 2 years? The EU would then have a great deal more to lose at the end of that negotiation.
Not for me.
Play the game, Jonathan.
Not for me to say. Somebody else's turn.
As Jonathan was saying, we're going to have at 27 a whole discussion about the new financial resources, the new multi-annual framework for our finances, and that will be when we tailor our new policies on structural funds, on regional assistance, on agriculture, on fisheries. We will have to take that into account. So it's going to be a whole new world for the European Union also. And of course, what has to be taken into account, and which is very difficult still today, what will be the state of our economy at that time, of the EU 27 economy? Will growth be back? Will the Eurozone have stabilized? So on and so forth. All this we don't know at the moment, and we will see. But we still have enough resources, I think, to move ahead. Even if, as Jonathan has said, we regret very much that Britain is going to drop out of the European Union.
That, with respect to the misunderstanding, the Article 50 agreement, whatever it contains, is concluded by the Council of Ministers of the European Union and the European Parliament giving its consent. The longer-term trade agreement, if it is done separately and takes longer, as many people think it would be, is like the CETA agreement with Canada, and if it contains matters which are the responsibility not of the Union exclusively but of the member states, then is subject to national ratification, and in countries where national ratification requires the consent of regional parliaments, as is the case in Belgium, then regional parliaments as well. So the long-term, deep, bold, adventurous free trade agreement, the long-term relationship agreement, whatever it's called, assuming it covers non-EU exclusive matters, that would have to be ratified by all member states in accordance with whatever constitutional arrangements they happen to have, and we talked about the Belgian ones. The Article 50 agreement is simply an EU agreement with the consent of the European Parliament, decision of the Council of Ministers, all of which has to be done within the 24-month period which has now started. And this side, my understanding is that, of course, it would have to be improved by the government and also by the British Parliament.
And am I right, Jonathan, in assuming that the decision by the Council is that qualified
majority without the UK, obviously?